Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Matti Friedman about his new book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe, about Hannah Senesh and the other parachutists whose exploits during World War II became one of Israel's foundational myths.
They think that the mission is to save Jews and fight the Nazis. But if you look closely at this mission, you see that they did not save any Jews and they did not kill a single Nazi. So what were they doing? And why are they heroes if the mission was a failure? So I'm trying to ask that question. Essentially, that's the question at the heart of the book.
Matti Friedman is the author of 5 works of nonfiction that have been translated into more than a dozen languages, and each of which has appeared on numerous Best Books of the Year lists and have been awarded prizes and accolades, including the Sammy Rohr Prize, the ALA's Sophie Brody Medal, the Canadian Jewish Book Award, and more. His new book, Out of the Sky, is his second to be awarded the Natan Notable Book Award, a committee I've loved being a part of since its inception. Matti is a former Associated Press correspondent. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. He currently writes from Israel for the Free Press. In this episode, Matti shares his particular lens as a Canadian-born journalist living in and writing about Israel for a Western audience.
I'm trying to explain what this place is. It's a very confusing place, and in some ways, the longer you live here, the more surprising it is, and the harder it is to understand. So it might be strange for me to say that a book that takes place in 1944 is meant to help us understand Israel now, but in a way, I hope it does.
And we'll discuss how seeing the real people behind legendary figures can make their deeds even more remarkable.
Hannah Senesh is kind of like Davy Crockett or something for Israelis. So when you go back to that character, you might expect that you'd be deconstructing that character. But in fact, I'm much more impressed with Hannah Senesh now than I was at the beginning when I saw her as a kind of two-dimensional heroine. When you get to know the real people behind the myths, they're much more impressive because they're real people.
All that and more coming up next, and stay tuned after the show for a short one-book moment, a book selection from a friend of the podcast, Dove Abramson. Welcome to The 5 Books. Matti, I'm so happy to have you here. I want to just start out by saying how much I admire your writing in general and how much I enjoyed reading Out of the Sky. I feel like you are just such a master storyteller. Your books take your reader along with you on a journey of discovery, and along the way you point us toward making meaning, and you complicate things and widen the frame and slow things down so that you help us sort of ascertain the distance between what really happened, what we think happened. And I think that approach is something that so many of us have come to associate with your writing, and is really, really powerful in this book. So thank you for sharing it with us.
I'm so glad to hear that review. It must be the first review I'm getting for this book, so it's a pleasure. I'm really glad you liked it.
I'm so glad. Your books have covered an array of topics, and this time period is something you've explored a little bit before, certainly in your book, Spies for No Country. What led you to telling this story? How'd you get here?
A few years ago, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's also a journalist, and I had finished writing a book about Leonard Cohen's concert tour in the Yom Kippur War. And I was looking for my next kind of marginal story to become obsessed with for a few years. I usually end up choosing stories that seem kind of obscure, but I try to make them say something big about Israel or about Jewish history or about history in general and humanity in general. And I was kind of kicking around. And a friend of mine mentioned the story of the parachutists. And the most famous of the parachutists is Hannah Senesh. So that's a name that I knew, and I had a vague idea of what the story was. And of course, I knew her most famous poem, which was put to music and is called Eli, Eli. So anyone who went to Hebrew school probably knows the song. So I knew her name and I knew something of her story, but I didn't really know that there were other parachutists who'd been involved in this mission, and I couldn't have named very many of them. And I started reading about it, and it turned out to be just a kind of wild story about a group of young Jews who managed to escape the Holocaust, make it to what was then British Mandate Palestine, and then So they make it to safety, essentially, and then they volunteer to parachute back into the Holocaust. And I don't think I'd ever really grasped the dramatic and kind of extreme nature of the story. So I started reading up on them. And of course, I didn't have anyone to interview because even the parachutists who survived the mission are not alive anymore. But I did discover that there are many, many documents from 1944 that really allow me to recreate the mission day by day. They really kept very careful records of the mission, and we have transmissions from the parachutists in Europe, and we have letters that were dispatched from occupied Europe, and we have the reports of their handlers in Tel Aviv, and we have an unpublished memoir by one of the British officers who ran the mission on behalf of British special operations. So there was a lot to work with, and it kind of carried me away onto an odyssey that lasted a couple of years, 3 or 4 years.
It's interesting that you say it as, you tell these obscure stories. Having read all of your books, you often return to these moments where history hardens into narrative. And as you say, you're trying to tell this bigger story. So I guess I'd ask you to expand a little bit on that and what you are hoping to do as a writer in telling these stories in these moments.
I'm glad you asked that question because it forces me to think about what I'm doing, which I don't spend a lot of time doing usually. I'm kind of just interested in something and I go off on some wild goose chase, and different people have given me different reflections of what my actual project is over the years. And I'm not sure that I've been too adept at kind of seeing what I'm doing as part of a bigger picture. But I think what I'm trying to do is first explain to myself the place where I live. So I moved to Israel when I was 17. I had a very simple story in my head about what this country was. This was 1995. And I have spent my entire adult life, this is 30 years, trying to figure out what this place is and trying to explain to myself how different it is than what I expected it to be. And each of my books, I think, is an attempt to explain something that I needed explained primarily to myself and only secondarily to other people. So I've written a fair bit about the Middle Eastern nature of Israel, which is, I think, maybe the biggest missing piece for observers looking at this country from abroad, whether they're sympathetic or unsympathetic or apathetic. People think of this as a European project when in fact the majority of the population is native to the Islamic world, including the Jewish population. And that is the key thing to understand about the country. So I wrote a book about the Aleppo Codex, which is a Hebrew manuscript that's kept by the Jews of Aleppo, Syria. And I wrote a book called Spies of No Country, which is about Israel's first spies. There are Jews from the Arab world who can kind of cross the street back into the Arab world and disappear. I wrote a book about my own military service, primarily, again, to explain to myself something very confusing that happened to me in the late 90s as I did my military service in South Lebanon in a very strange guerrilla war against Hezbollah. So I think I'm trying to put together the pieces and create a picture of Israel that will help me and others understand what the country is now in the 21st century. So we have a lot of old stories about Israel, Herzl and Ben Gurion and the pioneers and the Entebbe raid and the 6-Day War, but those don't really help us, I think, understand the country that much in the current moment. So what I'm trying to do is find dramatic and preferably little-known stories that have their own dramatic power so people could read them without having any interest in Israel or Jewish history. But I think that I'm trying to explain what this place is. It's a very confusing place, and in some ways, the longer you live here, the more surprising it is, and the harder it is to understand. So it might be strange for me to say that a book that takes place in 1944 is meant to help us understand Israel now, but in a way, I hope it does, because we're at a moment when Israel and Zionism are, to say they're controversial, I think would be understating it, but the existence of the country and the nature of this national project are subjects of incredible dispute and controversy. And I thought it would be useful to go back to the beginning, to kind of strip away 8 complicated decades of history and go back to almost a pure myth from the inception.
I think having this book come out now, when the story is so much about how a military operation can be viewed purely through a literary and narrative lens, is particularly prescient.
Talia, I want to hear more. What do you mean?
Just that the idea that its main impact was as a narrative and not actually any of their military operation, and that's the value that it continues to play when everyone all around us is just debating the narrative of Zionism, felt like particularly relevant.
I think you're right. I'm not sure that I had actually thought of that the Gaza war has been fought to such a great extent in the brains of observers. And it has been, of course, it has been a terrible and tragic war in reality, but that reality has largely been beside the point for the millions and millions of people who've been spinning different stories about what's going on. So, in 2026, we might be more comfortable with the idea of narrative warfare, where the actual event doesn't really matter. What matters is the story that you tell about it. And in some ways, it's a kind of an early example of an operation that might have been primarily aimed at creating a story and not at achieving anything on the ground.
Yeah, I think also probably it's been experienced so differently in Israel versus the rest of the world.
These events. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And I sit on that fence between events in Israel and events abroad just because I write in English and I go back and forth and I try to explain what's going on here to people abroad and mostly fail as far as I know. So the gap, there's a chasm between what people think is going on here and what is actually going on. And I became aware of that when I was a reporter for the AP years ago. And I wrote about it in 2014 in a few essays after I left the AP about how an ideological fantasy essentially had replaced a description of reality. And that was more than a decade ago. And it has only become more extreme because of different ideological currents in the West and because of social media and because of the increasingly kind of hysterical and binary nature of political discourse. Increasingly, I look at Western press coverage of this place and I have no idea what they're talking about. It's really completely divorced from events here, usually in a negative way, sometimes in a positive way, but there are very few people who seem to be interested in just describing what is going on in this very complicated place. So I'm trying to be one of those people, and I'm not the only one. There are others. But, we're at a moment of just an extreme gap between reality and narrative. And for many Jewish people looking at this from abroad, the gap is incredibly distressing, and people live with it almost every day as they have some idea of what's going on in Israel and then are kind of engulfed in a completely different set of ideas and responses in the society where people live. And it's part of the incredible dissonance and it's part of the really deeply disturbing nature of these times.
If you're someone who's drawn to thoughtful conversations about politics, culture, leadership, and Jewish identity, there's a podcast I think you'll really appreciate. It's called Identity Crisis from the Shalom Hartman Institute. Each week, host Yehuda Kurtzer brings a rare combination of moral rigor and genuine curiosity to the biggest questions facing Jewish life. Yehuda has also been a guest on the 5 Books, where we talked about his unusual upbringing as the child of a diplomat and about falling in love with 2nd century rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Yehuda sits down with a wide range of guests on his show, people like Harvard University President Alan Garber, author Sarah Hurwitz, and writer Franklin Foer, to talk through the big questions around Jewish life and identity today. What makes Identity Crisis stand out is that it doesn't rush to easy answers. Instead, it creates space for disagreement and nuance to talk about the most pressing issues of this Jewish moment, like leadership in polarized times, Israel and the Jewish people, free speech, or what responsibility looks like when values collide. If you're looking for a podcast creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life, I'd really recommend checking out Identity Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. Parshat Noach, the story of Noah from the Bible. If you could just tell us a little bit about what your household was like Jewishly growing up, and then what was the impetus for your family to move to Israel, or you to move to Israel at 17?
I grew up in, I guess, a traditional Jewish home would be the easiest way to describe it. It started out less traditional and became more so as time went on. I became more religiously observant as I got older, and I wore a kippah. I went to a public school, but I wore a kippah, so I kind of identified openly as Jewish in a social world that wasn't Jewish. This was in Toronto in the 90s. It was a very friendly time, and my experience was almost entirely positive, which raises the question, I guess, of why I moved to Israel when I was 17. And it's hard to recreate your mental state when you were 17, 30 years on. But I think that I thought I deserved a life more adventurous than the one that seemed to be waiting for me in suburban Toronto. And I also think that in a deeper way, I didn't want to be part of a minority. And even though it didn't seem to be terrible to be a minority in Toronto, I didn't want to live in a Jewish community that was separate from the mainstream. And I also didn't want to abandon my Jewish identity and kind of just subsume myself into the mainstream. And Israel really offered a solution to that, because in Israel, the mainstream is Jewish, and you can be a Jew in Israel, and you can express your Jewish identity by ordering pizza in Hebrew, or getting on a bus, or serving in the army, or paying taxes. And it's just a rich and very electric Jewish world. And it immediately kind of got its claws in me. So I came intending to be here for a year. Starting in 1995, I milked cows on a kibbutz. And then I decided after a few months that I was going to stay. And I've been here since then. So
you came by yourself. You didn't come with family.
I came by myself, and then my parents and my sister ended up moving 2 years later. So we all ultimately ended up here, but I did come by myself as a 17-year-old Canadian. I thought I was an adult. A few years ago, someone standing next to me said, "This is Matti. He moved to Israel when he was a kid." And I corrected them. I said, "I came when I was..." And then I realized I was 17, so I was a kid. But I definitely thought I was making a very informed decision about my future.
This is the perspective that changes when you have kids.
Right. Now I have kids who are older than I was when I moved to Israel. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you said that the story of Noah and the flood was a story that impacted your Jewish identity as a kid. So tell me about that.
My bar mitzvah Torah reading, so the section of the Torah that I was supposed to read when I turned 13, was the story of Noah from the book of Genesis. And I spent about a year, starting from age 12, learning to chant the Torah portion. And I spent a lot of time with this, with the story of Noah. So I feel personally connected to this guy who lives at a time of, just at a terrible time when things are awful. And God tells him, "Listen, this is not working out. I'm going to destroy the entire world, but you are going to survive, and I'm going to help you out." And he builds a ship, and he saves his family, and he saves the animals. And it's just you have to kind of get past the cliched idea of the story and the kind of children's fable of Noah and the ark, and kind of go right to this biblical text, which is really kind of a wild story. And I guess that was the first Jewish story that really kind of penetrated my head in a deep way. And to this day, every year when I encounter Noah, we read that story every fall, and I feel like I'm meeting an old friend.
You wrote in your email to me that you saw Noah's Ark as analogous to Herzl's state. So tell me more about that.
So that wasn't me at 13. I would like to claim that it was, but I'm not sure I could have really expressed that thought at age 13. But it does seem to me in the past couple of years, or more than a couple of years in Israel, that what we have here in Israel is a kind of Noah's Ark. So it's all kinds of people who washed up from different places in the world and couldn't survive in other places. So you have, Moroccan Jews, and you have Syrian Jews, and you have Polish Jews, and you have Arab Muslims, and you have Baha'i, and you have the Druze, and you have all kinds of cultures that you can't easily find in other places, and many of them are just deeply threatened in other places, and they survive here. I mean, I hear Yiddish spoken a couple times a week here in Jerusalem, and that's a language that many people would say is a dead language, but it's alive here. And it's one of the remarkable things about Israel. A couple of years ago, I was in the old city, and I heard a conversation, like a regular conversation, not a conversation in a religious context. It was a conversation in Aramaic between two Christians who spoke Aramaic. So there is something reminiscent of the Ark in this place. So it's a time of terrible violence and upheaval, and of course we're buffeted on the waves of the ocean. But we do have this Ark, which is kind of a miracle, and we're really lucky to have it.
I guess I was wondering, when you said this about meeting an old friend, you started to talk about your journalism. You have been a lone voice telling the world what to see, and I wondered if that was part of what draws you to know a story of him being what now, you can read in the story, like he seems like kind of a loony guy, just telling everybody the world's going to end. And I wonder if you feel that way at all writing about anti-Israel bias in the press.
No, I don't think I'm like Noah. I also am not completely alone. I think that other people noticed. At times it did feel like I was kind of crazy, right? If you're the only person saying something, or if you're one of a small number of people saying something, then you can start to doubt your own judgment. But in retrospect, I saw the beginning of something much bigger.
Yeah, I think there's a real theme of paying attention. And I think you have that with a bunch of your protagonists, like Leonard Cohen also.
It's so true. I really thought about it when I was writing about Leonard Cohen, but what a prophet is. It's possible that an artist or a prophet, it doesn't require divine communication. It's possible that artists just are paying closer attention. And I'm not saying I'm one of these people, but that there are people who have very sensitive antenna and can kind of catch the vibe of a time before other people. And it's not magic. It's just that they're paying close attention and they're being honest about what they see. It makes me read the books of the prophets in the Bible differently. Is this some kind of supernatural occurrence, prophecy, or are these just really attentive and very honest people?
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood. Who Wrote the Bible? By Richard Friedman.
So I read that book quite late. I guess this must have been maybe 10 years ago. So I'm 48. So I read it in my late 30s. And it's a really incredible explanation of the different theories behind the writing of the Bible. And he does a great job of making very complicated ideas comprehensible. And for anyone who grew up with the Tanakh, with the Bible, and who maybe reads it every week, it's incredible to see kind of the curtain pulled back a bit and to see the incredible creative and political and historical forces that are behind the creation of this book. And one of the things that I like most about it is that he ends the book not by dismantling the Bible and saying, listen, this is all just human, creation. This is just a fiction created for, politically expedient reasons. He doesn't do that at all. I don't think he really gets into the idea of whether the Bible is divine or not, but I think that we can have complex ideas about what divine means. I don't think that in order to believe that the book is divine, I don't think we need to imagine God being like a dude sitting at a table writing the Bible. And if that's not true, then the book isn't divine. He really, at the end of this book, which is kind of a dismantling of the Bible into its different components written by different people for different reasons, he puts it back together and he encourages us to read it as a book. Also as someone who tries to take very complicated things and make them easily comprehensible, which is a talent often looked down on by experts in various fields. But I'm sure he caught flack from his colleagues in the academy about, writing a popular book about this. And I'm sure they thought he was dumbing it down. And I'm sure they were incredibly jealous when it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. But Richard, if you're listening, you did a great job. And I think that ability to take just bewildering topics and make them accessible, whether it's Israeli politics or Jewish history or what's going on in America right now or who wrote the Bible, I think that's a very necessary talent. And I wish we had more people who knew how to do that.
You wrote in your email again that you said it felt like it made the Tanakh, the Bible, look more impressive to you, not less.
It really did. I was surprised at that. It, when you think the Bible just exists and you don't really think about it, then okay, it exists and it is what it is. But when you really go into the individual passages and words and you realize that incredibly smart people are writing it. So we have these stories that have endured for thousands and thousands of years and they remain some of the greatest stories ever told. And there's incredible depth in the stories. So you appreciate the geniuses who wrote the stories and wrote the laws and the geniuses who edited it into a series of books that would then go on to kind of serve as the foundations of a civilization that's still alive and kicking 3,000 years later. So it's an incredible accomplishment. And as a writer, or someone who thinks about how to present stories, it's very hard to match the people who wrote those stories in terms of their minimalist attitude toward what has to be written and what you can leave to the imagination of the reader. The characters are incredibly complex, and they're sketched so adeptly that you can go back to the story of Noah every single year, for 50 years or 90 years, and you can find something new in the story each time. So my estimation of whoever it was behind that book, or whoever they were, it makes me appreciate it more, not less.
We're going to talk about this a little more when we talk more about Out of the Sky, but I guess I was thinking a lot about how societies survive by having these foundational myths. The question is whether people are willing to revisit them honestly and look at them in a different way. That seems like a lot of what you are thinking about.
Right. That's another connection that hadn't occurred to me, that what Friedman does, the other Friedman does in that book, is he kind of takes it apart. He goes back to the myth, which is the Bible, and he takes it apart. And in some ways, for me, that makes it more amazing and not less amazing. And I think that I had a similar experience with Out of the Sky, where I went back to this myth, which is one of the founding myths of Israel, the story of Hannah Senesh and her comrades, these young people who do an absolutely crazy thing. They're safe and they go back into Nazi Europe. And I went back to them wondering what I was going to find. And, Hannah Senesh is kind of like Davy Crockett or something for Israelis. So when you go back to that character, you might expect that you'd be deconstructing that character, and that very little would remain of her. But in fact, I'm much more impressed with Hannah Senesh now than I was at the beginning when I saw her as a kind of two-dimensional heroine. When you get to know the real people behind the myths, they're much more impressive because they're real people. You understand that real people did this thing, and the action that they took was, you can wonder if it was, sane, but there's no question that it was impressive and that it was heroic, and the action was undertaken by people who are just people. And you read their letters, and you read Hannah's diary entries, and you read Chaviva Reich's, letters to various friends and lovers back home, and you read Enzo Sereni's letters to his kids, and you realize that these are people who we could know now, and that makes them not less amazing, but more amazing.
Yeah, and you think of them like in black and white as these historical, and your book really, in the same way I think of biblical characters, like flaws and all, you see them as real people.
In the Bible, there's no concern about flaws. It's really an amazing thing. I was recently reading the New Testament, where the figure at the center of the story is not flawed. And that makes it very different from the stories of the Hebrew Bible, where every single character is flawed. You think of a character like King David, who is this unbelievable, this gifted, artistic, brutal, human, terrible and wonderful character. And it just makes it seem real. I'm convinced that King David was real, not because I have any archaeological evidence, but because it seems impossible that anyone could make up a character like that, although of course it's perfectly possible. So when you are able to understand Hannah Senesh and these other characters as flawed human beings, which we really haven't been allowed to do until now, because there was a lot invested in the Zionist myth of Hannah, who was supposed to be this brave pioneer and this kind of plucky heroine, and she, loved working on the kibbutz, and she jumped out of an airplane, and she kind of became a cartoon character, which isn't that interesting. But in 2026, the times have changed, and we're allowed to present these characters in all of their complexity, and in my opinion, that makes them greater heroes than they were in the age of hagiographic worship.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview. Submission by Michel Houellebecq.
So I think Submission it's certainly one of the most important novels I've read in the past 20 years, if not the most important. And it's a controversial book, of course. It was written by the French writer Michel Houellebecq, who I actually had an opportunity to hear speak in Jerusalem. I guess this was last year. And, apropos what we were saying about artists and prophets being ahead of the times, not because they're in direct communication with God necessarily, but because they just see what's going on and are willing to write it. I think Houellebecq is really an example of someone like that. He is not constrained, for better or worse, by political correctness, and he writes whatever is on his mind, including scenes that I find quite vile and creepy. But that same instinct, I think, made him able to see an incredible social change going on in Europe and the West, which is not just the rise of Islam as a force in the West, but maybe primarily the decline of the West's confidence in itself, the decline of any sense of meaning in life, the decline of families, and the kind of atomized nature of much of Western existence, which makes Western societies vulnerable to a very confident challenge from a culture like Islam. And he was on it. I think the book came out in 2015. So things have really moved in the past decade, but in France, they were already moving at that time. One reason that I know that is because my neighborhood in South Jerusalem over the past 10 years has become very solidly French, because Jews have been leaving France. And he mentions that in the book, even though he's not Jewish, and it's not a book that's primarily concerned with Jews. But it's very interesting that there's a Jewish character in the book, a university student, whose family moves to Israel. And it's very jarring to see it in a book. He's on to that. And I see Houellebecq as a writer being a few steps ahead of everyone else in putting his finger on something very deep and scary that's going on.
So you mentioned the book being controversial, and it has been criticized as being Islamophobic. So I wonder how you respond to that critique and what you think he gets right.
I have a different approach to Islam as someone who lives in the Islamic world. So I live in a Jewish minority of 7 million people inside the Arab Muslim world, which is 300 million people, and inside the broader Islamic world, which is 2 billion people. So it's a quarter of the world's population. So for anyone who's living as a minority in the Islamic world and who deals with the challenge from the Islamic world on a daily basis, I don't think being concerned about Islam is a phobia. I think that, this is our daily life, and I certainly don't think that should be translated into hatred or into prejudice or anything like that. But Islam is an imperial culture, and it's a culture with a great, history behind it and very solid ideas about human relations and the way society should be organized. And many of those ideas completely contradict the ideas of the liberal West. What saves the book, in my opinion, from being a kind of bigoted diatribe, which it really isn't, but his critique, Houellebecq's critique, is primarily a critique of France. It's a critique of his own society, a society of which he's a part. That makes it a worthwhile read. It's not just about France, it's about the West writ large, but these are conversations that we need to be able to have. And if we're not able to have them in a kind of judicious way in the mainstream, then the discussions will be held by extremists from the edges of the political system. And that's also happening. And that's also quite dangerous, of course.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Hebrew Poetry by Yehuda Amichai and Leah Goldberg.
I found myself reading poetry recently. I'm not sure why that is, but I've been reading a lot of Yehuda Amichai, who's just an amazing Hebrew poet. He is translated into English, and you can read translations into English, and they are good, but it's not like reading it in the original Hebrew. And at this very moment, I'm reading a book of poetry by Leah Goldberg, who's a great Israeli poet. I'm not sure why it's a time that seems good for poetry. It's also easier to concentrate on something that's short and seems deep. I don't want to be, distracted from what's going on, but I don't necessarily want to have someone's version of current events shoved down my throat. And the poets have a lot to tell us about the world, and there's something optimistic about it, even if the poems are really sad.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe by Matti Friedman. You say in the introduction that this is a true account of my journey into their story. So why did you frame it that way?
I framed it that way because in initially wrote that it's a true story, which is what writers of nonfiction like to say about the books that they write. So I actually wrote that sentence, and I said, this is a true story, because I want people to understand that I'm not making anything up. This isn't a novel, and I'm not inventing dialogue, and I'm not inventing characters, and everything that I write in the book is based on a source that I found, documents and books and unpublished memoirs and things like that. But then I had to stop and wonder about that, because I think probably 10 or 20 years ago I would have written, this is a true story, and not thought about it too much. But I guess I'm old enough and I'm suspicious enough of my own tricks to kind of stop for a moment and wonder what my characters would think about that statement. Like, would Hannah Senesh, had she read this book, would she say, this is true? This is a true version of my story? Or Enzo Sereni, who's one of my favorite characters in this book, who's a 39-year-old Italian. He's a writer. These people were writers, and they write poems and books and plays. And would they think the story is true? And I'm not sure. I could feel them looking over my shoulder as I'm writing. And I thought I'd better hedge that a bit and write, this is a true account of my journey into their story, because of course this is a subjective account of the operation. And I'm not really even aiming to be comprehensive. And this is not a cold academic history. This is very much a personal book. It's written in the first person. I was inspired to some extent by a book called HHHH, which is a great book, also actually about parachutists in World War II, written by a French writer named Laurent Binet. I really recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it. It is a pretty wild book that really plays with the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction. And I was kind of inspired by his unabashed first person subjectivity when I took on this book. And most of my journalistic training was at the AP, which is very much a news agency. So there is no first person in the copy, and you're not supposed to be there. You're supposed to pretend not to be there. So there's no reporter present. It's just this kind of disembodied voice describing reality, which I liked at the time. And I think that's actually a good instruction for egotistical young reporters who want everything to be about them. And you're kind of forced to think about it differently. But ultimately, I realized that that's kind of fictional. To pretend you're not in the story, that you're not telling the story, requires actually some fictionalization. So I pretty early on began writing in the first person, but I tried to keep it to a minimum, because my stories are not meant to be about me. I'm only in them to the extent that it helps me tell the story of the subject that I'm trying to get across. So given that this is a very subjective account, and given that I allow myself to insert my own thoughts, and given that I'm choosing which characters to talk about and which episodes to discuss and how to put those episodes to work in pursuit of the goal that I'm interested in, I thought I better hedge my statement about it being a true story and explain that this is me trying to convey this story as accurately as possible for an audience in 2026.
We've introduced the outline of the story, which is of these parachutists in British Mandate Palestine who then parachute back into the Holocaust, into Europe. But what I hadn't realized is so much about you give the context for the British attitude toward these Jews who are itching to fight the Nazis at this time. And just for anyone else who didn't have that context, if you could just give us a little piece of that.
It's hard to recreate the world of the parachutists, and I spent a long time doing it, and I'm not 100% sure that I've done it. The challenge in writing history about the years before the state of Israel, and I've done this a few times, is that you have to shake the idea that there is a state of Israel, and you have to shake the idea that people know there is going to be a state of Israel. Because, of course, no one knows that there's going to be a state of Israel. They live in a state of blundering through the darkness, and all they see around them in the 1940s is decimation and destruction, and the idea that one day there's going to be a Jewish state. It seems impossible much of the time. So what we would now call Israel is at that time a British mandate territory called Palestine. And this is the waning days of the British Empire. And the British had declared Palestine to be the future Jewish national home. That happened after the First World War, but they'd been walking back that promise for a few years, because they've realized that it antagonizes the Arab world, and there are a lot more people in the Arab world than there are Jews. And particularly at a time of a world war, they can't really antagonize the Arab side, and they block Jewish immigration to the land of Israel precisely at the moment when it was most needed. When people needed to get out of Europe to escape the Nazis, they could not come to Palestine. And a lot of people died as a result. So the Jews in Palestine are both eager to fight the Nazis and they hate the British. And the characters in this story have to navigate that because they're in British uniform. They're British soldiers. I mean, the mission is a British mission, which is kind of played down in the Zionist mythology. But these are British military personnel who are dropped from British aircraft, and they have British code names, and they're being commanded by an obscure office called MI9, which is in charge of escape and evasion. And the guy in charge of them is named Tony Simmons, who's a very interesting character and a very kind of philo-Semitic British officer who the parachutists really like. But the broader context in the British army and among British authorities is that they don't care much for the Jews. They think that the Jews are kind of pushing their own agenda and that they should kind of wait patiently for the war to be over. And no one bombs the death camps at any point during the war. And no one cares about saving these people to the extent that the Nazis care about killing them. And that's a big part of the story of the war. So there's this push from the Jews in Palestine to form fighting units to join the Allies in fighting Nazi Germany. The Jews have a lot of people who want to fight because their families are being murdered by these people, and they'll do anything to help. And the British won't do it. They won't arm large numbers of Jews because they understand correctly that if they do that, then after the World War, the Jews are going to use those skills against the British in order to achieve independence. And of course, that was completely accurate, and it did happen. But so they wouldn't form battalions or brigades of Jews. So there's initially an idea to form a battalion that's going to parachute into Europe. Armed Jewish parachutists are going to go into Europe and organize a Jewish revolt against the Germans from behind enemy lines. And the British are not having any of this. What remains of this grandiose plan is a plan to send 32 parachutists in pairs or in threes into different countries in occupied Europe. And one of the people in charge of the British presence in the Middle East, Lord Moyne, he's on record as saying, I really like this plan because if we take some of the most talented Jews and send them into Nazi Europe, they're unlikely to return to cause trouble in Palestine. That's almost an exact quote. It's in the book. I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but that's pretty close to the wording. So there were other motivations here on the British side which didn't match what the Jews thought this operation was supposed to do.
And what that operation was supposed to do is also, a little bit unclear. And you present these two interpretations of it. You have this amazing passage of these two people meeting in a concentration camp, and one says to the other, like, I heard that at San Khan, a parachutist has come down to us from the sky. This like grand myth, someone has come to save us. It sounds like messianic. And at the same time, you give us the story of Egon Roth, who finds his former youth group counselor, Chaviva. She's one of the parachutists, and he's incredulous that they're there. And he says, suddenly a few heroes get up, get on a plane, and jump into an open grave. That's what you're kind of elucidating for us, is these two, like, are they these great mythic figures who are here to save the day, or are they just on a suicide mission?
Right. Are they deluded? And there are two poles of the mission, which are precisely the stories that you just told. So there's this scene that happens at the camp at Dachau when two prisoners are kind of standing in the yard, and one of them says to the other, did you know that there's a tzanhan in the camp? And tzanhan means parachutist in Hebrew, but the prisoner had never heard that word before because, of course, it's not a word from the Bible, which was the source of his Hebrew knowledge. But there are no parachutists in the Bible, so he didn't know exactly what the other guy meant. So yeah, the people kind of like in a Greek myth or something who came down from the sky. And also there we have to kind of go back to reality 80 years ago, where parachuting was an absolutely incredible and crazy thing to do. Now you can skydive, for a couple $100, and I did for this book. But at the time, the idea that you could jump out of an airplane, it was completely crazy. People had barely become used to the idea of airplanes. So it seemed like an absolutely mythic thing to do. And at the same time, you have this local Jew from Slovakia who's been living through the Holocaust for years by the time the parachutists show up. And he says, what are you doing here? We're doing everything we can to get out of here. And you think you're heroes who are kind of jumping out of airplanes and coming to save the Jews. All you've done is jump into an open grave. It's such a striking turn of phrase. And that's kind of the question I'm asking in this book. What was this mission? I mean, the mission, there are really two. The British think that these people are being dropped into enemy territory to serve as liaisons with the local partisans and the local resistance, and to help downed Allied airmen or escaped POWs escape from enemy territory back to British lines so they can be put back on airplanes and sent back into the war. So that's the British mission. That's why they're working for MI9, which is escape and evasion. The Jews, the Zionist movement, really the proto-Mossad, that's who's running this operation. People who will eventually, a few years down the line, found the Mossad. They think that the mission is to save Jews and fight the Nazis. But if you look closely at this mission, you see that they did not save any Jews and they did not kill a single Nazi. So what were they doing? And why are they heroes if the mission was a failure? And what did they imagine was going to happen when they went into Europe? So I'm trying to ask that question. Essentially, that's the question at the heart of the book.
You were writing this book, and then 10/7 happens, and so that you write about that in the book, and you write about losing people close to you who were killed that day and in the fighting afterward. I guess I'm wondering how writing the story in the midst of all of that going on changed how you approached it, or did it change how you approached it?
It really did. I started writing this book, or started really doing the research for it about a year before October 7th, and I think I thought I was writing ancient history. You know, I'm not sure that I could really inhabit the headspace of my characters. I'm not saying that I necessarily can now, but pre-October 7th, I think many of us felt that we had history figured out. And, you know, Zionism was going to solve the plight of the Jews here in the Middle East, and Western liberalism was going to solve the plight of the Jews, or had in fact solved the plight of the Jews in North America and in Europe. And we were kind of progressing toward a more perfect kind of existence. And when I moved to Israel from Canada in the 90s, I certainly thought I was moving from one solution to another. I didn't think that things were unresolved. And I think that for many of us on October 7th, that all came crashing down. And we realized that Israel is not the revolution in Jewish history that we had hoped for. And we saw images on October 7th that looked like pogroms. We saw, basically Cossacks rampaging through the village, raping women and seizing children and murdering people in their living rooms. And that was never supposed to happen in the sovereign state of Israel after 1948, when the Jews kind of convince themselves that they're not even Jews anymore. They're Israelis, which is something different. And of course, neither you nor your listeners need me to talk about what's happened in North America and in the West more broadly since October 7th, but the sense of safety and confidence has been shattered. And I think that post-October 7th, I could much more easily inhabit the headspace of the people who I'm writing about. And, I'm not saying that this war was a good thing by any stretch of the imagination, but for me, I think it really helped me inhabit a moment where there seemed to be no good choices. And, a moment where it's not clear what you can do or if anything can be done. And it made me appreciate these characters who were at a moment much darker than the current moment. So it seems dark to us, but to them, this probably would have seemed much less challenging given what they had to deal with. So they face utter darkness. I mean, the Jews are completely homeless, and the closest thing they have to a home is under British rule, and the British have no intention of allowing the Jews to create an independent state, and the Jews are being butchered across Europe, and all the doors are closed. There's nowhere for anyone to go. And at that moment, which is one of the darkest moments in Jewish history, these characters, this small group of people, they take action. They decide they're not going into bed, and they're not pulling the covers over their head, and they're not going to wait for this to pass, and they're not going to wait for someone else to do something, and they're not going to wait for the leaders to come up with some kind of realistic plan. They're going to get on an airplane, and they're going to jump into Nazi Europe. And they do that knowing that the odds that they're going to be able to have any effect are very, very slim. But they do it because they believe in action, because they've kind of absorbed the Zionist lesson, which is you act. You have to act. You can't be passive. Zionism is a rebellion against Jewish passivity. So even if it doesn't seem to make sense, and even if the payoff isn't clear at the time, you act. So people are required for a mission to parachute into occupied Europe. So you go, and how that's going to play out, you don't know. But at the very least, you are acting out a story that will inspire people to action and not to surrender. And that, I think, is really what the mission was about, more than it was about any kind of practical goal.
Yeah, your thesis is, as you write, that the mission isn't military, it's literary. And Hannah Senesh is the best writer, and that's where her story takes hold in a different way in the Israeli consciousness. So what do you think this story offers Israelis now?
I think that it's, I mean, if nothing else, it's a reminder that we've been through a lot and that sometimes things seem hopeless, but they're not as hopeless as they were then. And I think that it's a reminder that the Zionist prescription for dark and despondent times is not to see ourselves as victims and not to complain about how bitter our fate is. Hannah Senesh did not do that. She could have. She had good reason to do it, but that's not what she was doing, and that's not what the people around her were doing. They rejected the idea that they were victims, even though they could really make a very strong case. I mean, the Zionists of that time had invented a really incredible kind of alchemy almost, which is about storytelling. So they did not refer to themselves as refugees. They referred to themselves as pioneers. They're actors in history. They're not a prop and they're not a victim. And you might think that they're homeless because they all had to run away from their homes in Europe. But no, those were never their homes. Now they're home. Now they're in the land of Israel, and it's narrative. I mean, it's a story, and there are many different ways of understanding their fate at that time, but they refused the interpretation that would have rendered them helpless victims. And instead, they told themselves that they were commandos, that they were parachutists, that they were pioneers. And it seems crazy, and it seems unrealistic, and it seems like a very extreme expectation of storytelling to be able to reverse people's fate in the real world. And yet, I'm speaking to you from Israel right now, and it reminds me of Herzl in Paris in the mid 1890s. Also had a moment of incredible darkness, and things are changing in Europe for the worse. And if a Jewish state seemed unlikely to someone like Hannah Senesh, then for someone like Theodor Herzl, I mean, it was an absolute impossibility. And he's faced with this change in the climate in Europe and this just surging hatred toward Jews. And he's in Paris, which is the most liberal city in Europe, and he sees crowds in the street shouting death to the Jews. And he doesn't go around like pushing a campaign against anti-Semitism. He doesn't have a Facebook campaign about how great the Jews are and how people should be nice to them or something. And he doesn't try to knock on the doors of, Austrian members of parliament to try to get them to sign on to anti-hate legislation or something like that. Not that I'm saying that those things aren't necessary, but Theodor Herzl sits down in his hotel room and he writes a pamphlet. He writes a story. And it's a crazy story when you read it. And it certainly seemed even crazier at the time. And the story was called The Jewish State. And again, I'm sitting in it. So Israel is proof of the power of storytelling. And in fact, Jewish history, which is really the result of storytelling, and that's really all it is. What connects a Jew in Yemen to a Jew in Warsaw to a Jew in New York? What is it? It's just these books that we all agree on. So the Jews know, I think, better than most people that stories have real power. So if you think it's crazy to jump out of an airplane in order to write a story with your own blood, I mean, yes. But if we could interview Hannah Senesh, I think she would say something different about it.
I so appreciate you telling this story and telling it from the perspective that you do. You have this impulse to contextualize things, to complicate them, and also appreciating the myth and holding it up close for inspection and still allowing that myth to have its power. And I think being able to question and cherish these foundational stories is really a rare gift to the reader. So thank you for this book, and thank you for being with us for today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we go, we have a special extra, a one-book moment, if you will, to share with you today. From time to time, we bring you a short, standalone selection from a friend of the podcast, a quick listen meant to spark curiosity and send you back to the books. This selection is from Dove Abramson. Dove's team designed the incredible artwork for our show. Dove is an artist and graphic designer who was born in the U.S. and moved to Israel as a young child. He studied at the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem and has received numerous awards for his art. We invite you to take a close look at the artwork on our website and spot the afikomanim, or the Easter eggs, that reference Jewish culture and the American Jewish experience. We'll share a link to his studio's website in the show notes. Enjoy!
The Jewish book that not only changed my worldview, but literally blew my mind was Operation Shylock by Philip Roth. In 1993, I was a yeshiva high school senior in Jerusalem. My father, who is an Orthodox rabbi and amazingly also a Philip Roth fan, had the book lying around the house. He had just received it from a friend in New York. It had just come out. And I was a kid that loved to read, so I just picked it up and started reading. And in the first few pages, I was taken in, mainly because most of it was taking place right around the corner from where I lived. All these places in Jerusalem that were in the book. And as I was going into it, all these characters that Philip Roth was writing about, he was giving them voices and narratives that were challenging everything that I had held true. As a family that had made Aliyah 10 years prior when I was in second grade, I was an Orthodox Zionist. And here's this Moshe Pipik, this imposter of Philip Roth, who's preaching diasporism, saying that the Jews are better off, way better off, out of Israel, and that Israel is the end of the Jewish people, not the Atchalta de Geula, not the beginning of the redemption, as I was brought up on, both in my schooling and in my household. And all these other characters in the book, the recovering anti-Semite, Smilesberger, the Shin Bet people, George Zaid from Ramallah, they were all bringing different perspectives that I was aware of as a 17-year-old living in Israel, but I had never heard them put in the mouth of an American Jew, which is really my mother tongue in a way. And I think that's what I found really, really fascinating. The climax of it for me was one of those rants that Philip Roth goes on about the Chafetz Chaim, about Lashon Hara, about bad tongue. And he talks about psychology being Lashon Hara, about the talking, that Jews talk too much. And in there he talks about the divisiveness of the Jewish people. And he has a line in there where he says, why must the Jews be in conflict with one another? Why must they be in conflict with themselves? Because the divisiveness is not just between Jew and Jew. It is within the individual Jew. Inside every Jew, there is a mob of Jews, Philip Roth writes. This is amazing to me. The good Jew, the bad Jew. The new Jew, the old Jew. The lover of Jews, the hater of Jews. The friend of the Goy, the enemy of the Goy. The arrogant Jew, the wounded Jew. The pious Jew, the rascal Jew. The coarse Jew, the gentle Jew. The defiant Jew, the appeasing Jew. The Jewish Jew, the de-Jewed Jew. And I think it's this passage that really hit me, maybe not so much at the time, but it's what I take with me from Philip Roth's writing about my own Jewishness and my Jewish identity. I think there are days that I wake up thinking that I'm the good Jew, and other days that I am not so good a Jew. Some days I'm a Zionist, and some days I'm a diasporist. And these past 2 years, since October 7th, diasporism has taken on a very, very realistic twist here in the Israeli society on about half of my social media feed. And the other half remind me of other voices that I saw in Operation Shylock, 33 years ago. So I think that Operation Shylock to me was that bringing forth those voices in my own identity that I didn't even realize were maybe dormant, and embrace them and understand that it's always a machloket, even if it's with ourselves. And it's part of the Jewish experience, at least for me. And once I accept that, it's easier for me to be a Jew of any kind.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Matti Friedman, talking about his book Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe. You can find a link to his book and all the others Matti discussed in our show notes. We also used a clip from Eli Eli, recorded by Ofra Chaza and the Hatikva Neighborhood Workshop Theater in 1977. You can find the whole album, Atik Noshan, on YouTube. We'll link it in our show notes. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or to our email, team@5bookspod.org. And if you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed and more recommendations directly to your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thank you to Dove Abramson, to the Jewish Book Council, and thanks especially to Rob Mank for his help with this episode and to Felicia Herman and David Ben-Or for their generous support.